It's often said that leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. And as a speaker, you're an influencer too. You've got some points you want to share with your audience, and presumably you want your audience to do something differently as a result of hearing your ideas, don't you? Well, my point today is simply this, that as a speaker, you're an influencer if people do something differently as a result of hearing you share your ideas. Now, the thing is, as much as you might want to, you can't get people to change their behaviour simply by trying to change their behaviour. And that's because our behaviour is based on our emotions, which are based on our attitudes, values, and beliefs. So if you can't get people to change their behaviour simply by trying to change their behaviour, how do you go about influencing an audience in such a way that they do end up doing something differently? Well, if you really think about it, you make your decisions based on your emotions too, don't you? And then you justify those decisions with logic. I know I do. It's certainly true for the decisions about buying ideas, about buying things, but it's also true for the decisions about buying ideas, such as the ideas that you're going to be sharing in your next talk. And it's the stories in your talk that connect with the emotions. So every point needs a story. Some years ago, I used to teach violin as a peripatetic music teacher. And one of my students was a young lady called Steph. Now, Steph was in year 11 and studying for her grade 5. And she was absolutely focused on practicing the pieces that she was going to have to play for her next exam. And she had little interest in playing anything else at all. She wanted to play the pieces, but never really got a feel for the music. She wanted to learn the tunes without having to learn the techniques. Now, the thing about playing the violin is that it's not just about playing the right notes, although that certainly helps. My violin teacher was a rather short, slim, elderly lady called Mrs. Vera K. Stubbington. And I can remember when she took me on one side in one of my lessons and said to me, "Roger, it's not just about playing the notes. It's about feeling the music." Mrs. Stubbington taught me all the usual scales and arpeggios and exam pieces and that kind of thing, but she also used some studies and exercises to help me learn all the techniques that a violinist needs to be able to use. Techniques such as harmonics, which is where you rest a finger very gently on the string to play a note an octave or more higher, a bit like this. Or spiccato, which is where you get the bow bouncing on the string to play a note, to play very short staccato notes, a bit like this. Or double stopping, which is where you play notes on two different strings at the same time, a bit like this. She then had me learn some pieces that use those techniques so that I could really get a feel for the music whilst playing them. Now, one of my all-time favourite pieces was a piece called Csárdás. It's a Hungarian gypsy dance written by an Italian composer called Vittorio Monti back in 1904. Now, for those of you who know the piece, you'll know that it's a really flamboyant piece that uses all of those techniques and more. And it's one of the pieces I used to love practicing. I used to love performing when I was playing in concerts some years ago. The notes are necessary, but it's the feel that's important. Steph played the notes, but without any real feeling. If you want your audience to do something differently, you need to feel the music to connect with them emotionally, so they'll want to sing along with you. Well, every point needs a story, and every story needs a point. And the point of that story is that you need to feel the music to connect with your audience emotionally. So you found yourself a personal story to illustrate your point and really bring it to life. You've managed to connect with your audience emotionally, so they're all sitting there singing along with you. But if you want your audience to continue to do something differently, they're going to need a little more. They're going to need to know how to apply what they've learned. So I wonder if my PSA friends can help me think of a way of remembering point, story, application. When I started to play bass guitar regularly in a band, my bass playing friends gave me some advice. They said to me, Roger, you need to remember two things. You need to feel the groove and stay on the beat. So I took their advice and I worked really hard. Whenever I was practicing, I'd work on finding the rhythm and feeling the groove. I'd listen out for the kick drum so that I could sync with the kick drum and stay on the beat. Well, do you know, one day we started practicing a piece that had, or learning a piece that had an awesome bass part to it. And I just loved practicing it. And in fact, as I started to get the hang of it, I could really feel the groove whilst I was playing it. And I found myself playing in the pocket, so to speak. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure whose pocket I was in, but hey, that's how my muso mates described it anyway. Well, at the next band practice, we started playing this piece, and I was there. I was feeling the groove. I was playing in the pocket. Even the neck was going. And then I looked across at the drummer, and he was giving me a right old glare. It seems I'd fallen off the beat, hadn't I? So now I had to figure out how to feel the groove and stay right on the beat, both at the same time. Well, the technique I learned had to do with tapping my foot. Now, I've been playing in orchestras for years where it's really frowned upon to tap your foot. Can you imagine going to a concert and seeing all the musicians tapping their feet slightly out of time with each other? It'd look awful. And anyway, it's not allowed. You're supposed to be watching the conductor for your timing. But with bass guitar, it's encouraged. And it's a dead simple technique too. Simply tap your heel, not your toe. You try it next time you're listening to some music, and you'll find your whole body starts to move in sync with the music. Now, my behaviour had changed forever because I'd applied what I'd learned. Now I could really feel the groove and stay on the beat simply by tapping my heel, not my toe. Next time you share your ideas, will you be able to feel the music? Just as I need to feel the groove and stay on the beat. Or swing the tune and add some improvisation when playing the violin. Or are you going to be just like Steph, who simply wanted to play the notes? Well, let me take you back to my dear old violin teacher, Mrs. Vera K. Stubbington, and her front parlour, which is where she gave lessons. And naturally, Mrs. Stubbington had a cat, didn't she? Called Felix. Now, not many people know that cats can feel the music too, but they can. And Felix was no exception. In fact, he'd let you know in no uncertain terms when he couldn't feel the music. We used to measure my progress in learning a new tune in cat minutes. You see, whenever I got a new piece of music to learn, I'd put it on the stand, I'd start playing through. And Felix would head straight for the door. He'd be out of there. He'd strut out of the room with his tail in the air, looking back over his shoulder as if to say, what on earth do you call that? But then as I started to get a feel for the music, he might hang around a little longer. And I can remember the first day when Mrs. Stubbington came out of my lesson at the end and said to my mum, who was in the waiting room, Mrs. Fairhead, Roger played really well today. Felix stayed in the room right the way through to the end of his lesson. So I'd like to leave you with a question. How long does your audience stay in the room? Of course, I mean mentally. They wouldn't be so rude as to leave the room physically like Felix did, strutting out with his tail in the air. No, how long does your audience stay in the room mentally? Because that's measured in cat minutes. You need to feel the groove and stay on the beat. You need to swing the tune and add some improvisation. You need to feel the music to connect with your audience emotionally. So they'll want to stay in the room. They'll want to sing along with you, and they'll want to buy into your ideas. And that, my friends, is influence.
Roger.
Thanks, Steve.
Well done, my friend. Thank you.